Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Trianis, Dean of the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Carey Business School Distinguished Speaker Series. Through our Distinguished Speakers Series, we bring to you the most accomplished business professionals to discuss today's most compelling business challenges. Johns Hopkins University was America's first academic research institution. Many of the scientific discoveries and innovations made here have revolutionized society. Of course, these discoveries and innovations must be scalable, profitable, and executable to have impact and provide lasting value for all, which is where business plays an important role. We are very pleased to have Christoph Lengauer with us today. Christoph is partner at Third Rock Ventures. As a venture capitalist, he's contributed to the discovery and development of 8 FDA-approved medicines and several drugs currently in clinical trials. Less than 2 years ago, he co-founded Thrive Early Detection, a Johns Hopkins spinoff that develops a multi-cancer detection blood test. Third Rock provided significant funding. Earlier this year, the company was acquired for $2.1 billion. Christoph has a PhD in biology from Heidelberg University, an MS in human genetics from the University of Salzburg, and he earned his MBA here at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. We're also very pleased to have Christy Wyskiel with us today. Excuse me. Christy is a senior advisor to the president of Johns Hopkins University for innovation and entrepreneurship. In addition, Christy is executive director of Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, which aims to translate the university's research and discoveries into accessible and beneficial technologies, products, and services. Christy is a seasoned entrepreneur, investor, and ecosystem builder with 25 years of experience focused on the life sciences and healthcare industries. We're also proud to have Christy as a member of the Carey Business School faculty. I'm going to turn our program over now to Christy, who will lead our discussion, but let me first note that we're also anxious to hear questions from our audience. So please submit them using the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point during the discussion, and Christy will try to incorporate as many of them as possible later in the discussion. So Christy, over to you now.
Great, thank you, Alex. This is such an honor to be part of the Distinguished Speaker Series with the Carey Business School, Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures, and Carey. Really just enjoy this thriving entrepreneurship scene that we have at Johns Hopkins, and I think no one embodies that better than our special guest, Christoph Lengauer. I've had the incredible pleasure of getting to know Christoph and working with him over the last few years. Founding what has already become one of the most successful technologies and companies that has come out of the research at Johns Hopkins. And so, Christoph, I'd love to hear your perspective on trends in biotech right now. Talk to us about what you're seeing as an investor, as an entrepreneur, and where do you think that the jobs really will be in life sciences in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. Good question. I guess trends, right? They go always anywhere where they can solve a problem, and therefore maybe let's just talk about the problems then. And there is, of course, the continued medical need, that the suffering that patients go through in spite of all the advances that we have been making. But it continues, and it really doesn't matter which disease. From common diseases like cancer, which I am a lot involved with, but towards rare diseases, there may be only like 40, 50 patients on this planet have, but the suffering can be tremendous. Therefore, that's sort of that area, but it's the obvious one. Then there's the less obvious one, which is access to medicine. We will see there, I think, developments that are needed, because it continues to be unfair the way we sort of distribute medicines, and it's unfortunately also very biased. And then lastly, the area of cost. Costs continue to increase. It becomes an issue for access. And how to solve for that, right? You need enormous innovation to be more productive in the process of drug discovery and development. Remember, it takes about 1.2 to 1.5 billion dollar to get a drug on the market. That continues to be unsustainable. But then there's also the middleman. The middleman in the system that sort of eat up a lot of the so-called profit, and we need innovation in that area also, which of course is likely to be very disruptive. To summarize, not only in the space of technology and in the space of like biology and chemistry, and you have it, but also in areas that we are not thinking about it much today. Be it access, be it data, be it simplification of processes and cost.
Great, thank you so much. I think one thing that I'd love to hear more about, and that I think this crowd would love to hear about, are some of the inflection points in your career. We mentioned, of course, in the opening that you were instrumental in helping move Thrive Early Detection from concept to exit. And building these companies is, of course, very complex. Talk to us about your career, what led you to Thrive, and then I probably will have some follow-up questions about that journey as well.
Yeah, I mean, as my background indicates, sort of, I'm from Europe. I never really wanted to go to the US. It was actually a very interesting situation. I wanted to give up science. Some of you on the call might sort of understand that well. I was a postdoc, was very successful. I published good papers prior to being a postdoc. During my PhD, I helped develop a technology called FISH technology, stands for fluorescence in situ hybridization, multicolor staining of chromosomes. But then I got very frustrated how complicated it is to do science, and how little impact it might have, in spite of the fact that we write those Nature Science and Cell papers. And before giving up on it, I decided I'll apply to what I considered the best molecular oncology lab in the world, and try to get in. And if I don't like it, then at least it's okay. And that's basically what I wrote in a message to Bert Wollerstein at Hopkins, the School of Medicine, which I by far thought was the best lab in the world at the time. It was the hottest lab of the world based on citation index. P53, P21 were just published, two tumor suppressor genes that really are the dominant genes in understanding cancer. And I applied and said, like, look, I'm on the verge of giving up, can I come? And 2 weeks later, I started in Bert's lab, and I liked it a lot. And I ended up staying 13 years. I co-led the lab together with Bert Wollerstein and Ken Kinsler at the School of Medicine and oncology space. And I loved it. And people always ask me, why did you ever leave this place? Okay, I mean, I wanted to do drug discovery. That became clear at some point, and you can't do this in academia. Academia is not set up to deliver drugs or drug products. And I joined industry. I was in big pharma first. I was at Novartis, and then became global head of oncology for Sanofi, where I led not only research but also phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. And it was very successful, but I didn't like it because I ended up deciding on the color of the carpet of the new building, and didn't really feel like that's the real impact. And that's why after that second third of my career, I ended up being in biotech. And I was founding chief scientific officer of a company where I was number 11 in the company. company is called Blueprint Medicines. It just celebrated last week its 10th anniversary, and it's only the second biotech company that has succeeded to bring 2 drugs to the market within its first 10 years of existence. It is now a public company. It did IPO a few years back, 6 years back. Its market cap is now $5.5, $6 billion, something like that. But most importantly, it has made drugs that help many cancer patients. And that's how I sort of got like this feeling for entrepreneur and that overlap between science and medicine and business, and ended up becoming a partner at Third Rock Ventures. We can talk more about that later. And in that context, started several other companies, Relay Therapeutics being one, also now a public company, $3.5 billion market cap. Started, MoMA and Celsius and others, EQRX in the context of drug pricing, actually. And 2 years ago, Thrive, because of the relationship with Bert and Ken and Nick at Hopkins, where we took it out of that setting and professionalized it and brought that multi-cancer screening test forward, that ended up in the acquisition by Exact Sciences earlier this year.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. Of course, I had a front row seat to the incredible work that you did there. Take us back though to, one of the, I think it's fair to say that Johns Hopkins is proud to count you not only as faculty that did this lab work, but also, of course, as a graduate of the business school. Talk to us about that journey. At what point along the way did you get your MBA, and how did that lead you to really think about that first Novartis job? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was young faculty member at the time here at Hopkins School of Medicine, and I decided to do 2 things, both in the context of the bigger Hopkins context. One is I became assistant coach of the women's soccer team, Homewood campus. It's important to me. I love soccer, and I was there at the time the only assistant coach of the women's team. And the second thing is the other affinity in a way was, how can one connect science and medicine better with business? Because very often science ends up in this ivory tower, and in spite of all that smart people involved and the innovations that we make, and this of course firsthand, trying to actually translate that into business, and with that sort of reducing suffering because of building sort of commercial organization, is not trivial at all. You have little help in that. You don't know how to do this. You get a lot of bad advice, and it's not something that somebody teaches you. There's no study for that. There's no program for that. And I thought the only way to kind of get towards that is to engage in the leadership program at the Carey Business School, and that sort of brought me into doing the full graduate program.
Great, and we have a question that relates right to this from Gustavo in the audience. He's saying he has that same sense about impact. It sounds like he's getting his PhD and is really interested in the industry and entrepreneurship route, even before so far as going to get a postdoc. What kind of experience would you advise for someone like him, and how did the MBA boost that experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. It also sort of exemplifies the dilemma. Okay, there are no direct or clear paths of how to do this, and my advice is you have to have an anchor in something. Okay, I mean, because that allows you then from there on sort of to explore, because you need to be really useful. It's very competitive out there. This is this is all tricky. It's very thin up there too. Okay, the air is thin. It's difficult. Therefore, you have to have an anchor where you are just the best in the world, and like, you know, in that space, you need to be comfortable. And it matters less what that is. That can be in your PhD and postdoc, but you have to have shown that you can achieve something, maybe in a couple of different environments, and that's your anchor, that's your base. And from there on, I think you can explore, you can diverge into areas that you're less familiar with, and diversify. But if it's not a PhD, then it could be in business. I guess that's not necessarily some people think that's the direct route, right? If you want to go industry and do business, I don't think so at all. I actually think you need that overlap ideally. And that's where programs like in a Carey Business School are very important, right? Like where you can speak both languages without the strong accent, the science and the business. And I think that's extremely helpful in order to then be successful and to get exposed towards that overlap between science, medicine, and business. Therefore, there's no, in summary, there's not like one path. The only advice I have is anchor yourself in something very extremely strong, and from that position of strength, sort of diversify and explore as you are interested.
Great advice. Great advice. So let's go back to Thrive again. This is a wonderful success story for Third Rock Ventures, for Bert Vogelstein, Ken Kinsler, Nick Papadopoulos, the inventors, scientists at Johns Hopkins, of course, who you worked with, for Johns Hopkins itself, and also, of course, Christoph, for you personally. Take us back. I mean, I remember sitting in, I think it was a bar in Boston with you many years ago, having a conversation about impact and how we could do this. And it was really through many, you and I both know, many conversations that you were able to have to really set this vision forth, right? It's not at all, it's not at all an exaggeration to say that this would not have happened without you. And so take us back. You know, this is a company that raised 100 million in the A round, 250 plus million in the B round, was sold within less than 2 years of founding. I mean, this was a runaway success. And of course, the science was incredible, but it couldn't have happened without thinking about the business pieces of this. So take us back to right when you were at the creation of Thrive, and describe kind of what you saw and how you got it to a place that was a really palatable business for investors.
Yeah, I think there's, you're right. I mean, a lot of things came together, and that's necessary to create such successes. But there's also patterns in there that I think are very applicable in general. The first one is the value proposition from a medical impact perspective. Today we have screening tests for 4 cancers. That's colon, breast, lung, maybe 3.5 really, you know. And the idea of those is to detect cancer early. The earlier you can detect cancer, the better. And the cure rate of cancer in its early stages in the high 90%, okay, 85, 90%, okay. Versus if you detect the cancer in its metastatic stage, then there's almost never a cure, and the survival rate for the next 5 years is maybe in the 10%. That's our reality. And therefore the challenge is, how can we detect cancer earlier, because then it can be cured. But that value proposition is very clear, and the idea that the Hopkins lab has was, if we were to be able to detect minute amounts of DNA that get shed by the cancer into the bloodstream, and we were to take a little bit of blood at the routine annual exam, could we develop technologies that allow us that to, in a very precise and reproducible way detect this minute amount of DNA, and with that call out cancer. And that's really what Bert Wostein, Ken Kinsler, and Nick Papadopoulos at Hopkins have been working on for 20 years or so. All their knowledge about cancer and the mutations and the genetics has been put into the concept of develop this test. Therefore, that's for me that second step. One is that medical need and the value proposition. The second one is that invention and that creativity, where places like Hopkins can deliver on that. But that's only the beginning. And and you referred to that, Christy, if you leave this alone, it is not gonna be successful. It does not translate. The best invention does not necessarily result in a functional or, like flourishing business whatsoever. This is its own skill set. That's different. That's foreign to scientists. I actually think most scientists shouldn't touch it. That's that issue of founders becoming entrepreneurs, which I do not necessarily advise for. There's like founders should be founders because that's what they are good at. And then you need to add that skill sets of equally talented people that understand business dynamics, decision-making, financing, all those components. And also from a test, you bring it to FDA, and you need to think about how to get reimbursed for it. In such a test, adoption will depend on FDA approval, but also on reimbursement. Therefore, you need to think about reimbursement path. This is a health economics question. You need to show from a health economics perspective for the task force that makes those decisions here in the US that value proposition is there in such a screening test. And this needs to be all thought. There's politics involved. This is lobbying in DC. This is a lot of money towards, showing safety in those tests. Therefore, this is where the business comes in. And like we at Third Rock, we happen to be really good in building companies. It's the most successful venture fund in the world, not only in life sciences. And we only build companies that we only invest in companies that we have a chance to build and be involved in the leadership. And I guess maybe that's the fourth and last point here is that's where it takes a lot of trust by academic founders to actually give up some form of control. You want to be involved. You want to continue to be involved in the science, for example, and it can be warranted as founders, as board members, whatsoever. But then you need to give up control over the governance of the company that you help found, over the money, over the investment decisions. There has to be a commitment when somebody then invests like 75 million in Series A, $268 million in the Series B. And then you dilute your shares as a founder, and you trust that in the end, you have less of a slice of that pie, but that pie becomes really big. And I tell you, it's much better to have a small slice of a big pie than to have a big slice of a pie that doesn't exist. And that's a lot of trust. That's a lot of collaboration. That's where, of course, our relationship between my former lab and now my sort of company at Third Rock sort of was instrumental. And in that, then you have the ingredients in order to be successful, but you need all of them. You need that science, that medicine, and that business component.
Christoph, if I had a dollar for every time I had to have the slice of pie conversation with our faculty, I'm pretty sure I could buy pie for all the faculty. But anyhow, you're absolutely right. We have a couple questions from the audience. So I'm going to go to those while we're before I get back to what we were talking about. One is from Linda. She's asking the question, who really made the decision, and how was the decision made to sell Thrive rather than go public? Obviously, it's a very hot biotech IPO market. Could have gone either way. Is there anything you're able to share about that?
Yeah, I can share some of it. And it's a good question, right? I mean, first of all, it was like outrageously early, the whole thing, right? I mean, we do a Series A, about a year in, we raise a Series B at a much better valuation. Therefore, I think that was super successful. That Series B was extremely important because those $270-ish million set us up to have optionality. And I think that's for a business, it's key to have different options. What were those options? Number one is we get clarity of our path with the FDA, and with that clarity and a clear time perspective, we raise more money in the public market, which means we could have done an IPO. The second one is, of course, to engage in conversations around potential merger acquisitions, and Exact, who was a very early investor, a couple of percent early on at Thrive. Again, this is all like part of that strategy to familiarize potential strategic investors with your company early on. And they liked us from the beginning. They had watched us, what we are doing. They believed in the path that we are taking. And then sort of, towards like late fall that year, when we were thinking about which path to take, sort of that unsolicited approach by Exact came towards a potential acquisition. The second path, you never plan for that, because companies are not sold, companies get bought, right? Therefore I don't believe in planning out merger and acquisitions. But the optionality should be there. And then there was the third one, which I personally liked a lot, which is we had financed the company really well. We had a good cushion towards solidifying both the science as well as our regulatory path with our Series B, and just take it step by step, not to rush it, not to see sort of an IPO as an exit. But see it as one potential way of financing, but also consider a private financing round that might have been like, a year later for $500-600 million, which we think we could have raised, and stay private. There's a lot of advantages of staying private from a governance perspective, from working under the radar, like doing your thing, not being driven by the street, and building that way a sustainable business that eventually also has a value that maybe even goes beyond that. For a lot of options, we're not really, and we had a lot to think about when we made that decision to actually go with Exact. As a board member, I was part of that decision making, and we thought it was a decision. It was a very practical decision. What comes together is, and that's another important component maybe, what Exact brings is a sales force, an integration of their Cologuard test. That's a stool test which is out there. Exact, of course, is a public company. That they also, they bring that experience of Salesforce marketing, connectivity to the primary care physicians' offices, a lot of financial power, of course, as a $22 billion company. And that sort of allows you to maybe bring that test forward without worrying as you grow up as a company, not only do the discovery and then the product development, but then also have to cover the commercialization piece, which has its traps also. Therefore, we thought this brings the forces together, and is maybe the best decision for bringing the test to patients in the most effective way.
Christoph, I don't know if you remember this, but you foreshadowed that event. You and I sat in the conference rooms in East Baltimore when we were having conversations about the the beginnings of the company. And I remember you saying, if someone, Christy, were to offer to buy this today for 100 million, we would say no. For 500 million, we would say no. For $1 billion, we would say no. This is highly valuable. So you were very true to your word with that, and prescient in the sense that that you knew how to play out. You saw exactly how the chess game was going to be played. So just back to the initial question I asked, there's a question about career paths for students in biology. This also might include undergrads who are quite interested in biology. Maybe just talk about, there's a path, of course, get a PhD, go into academia, but there are just so many interesting jobs for those interested in science. Can you just talk a little bit more, if you were advising, say, let's say my 20-year-old daughter who's interested in biology, what would you say to the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, it happens often. People ask me for career advice, especially people who are considering the science path, right? The first question I have is, how certain are you about science? Okay, how passionate are you about it? And very often the answer is, yeah, I think I like it. I could see myself. I'm like, then don't do it. Your answer has to be like, this is the only thing I want to do. I'm totally passionate about it because I think that's a requirement in order to be successful as a scientist. It's a very tough job. Take drug discovery as an example. Most of my colleagues work all their life, day in, day out, on trying to deliver a drug, and they never participate in a project that eventually leads to drug approval. And that is about 98% of all people who work in that space. It's like if you were to sell shoes, and eventually all your life you build up, that's what I try to do. You build up, like the windows, and like you put it at the shelves, and you clean the shoe and polish and whatever. And eventually you retire. And the day you retire, you have to say you have never sold a pair of shoes. That's the job of a scientist in industry. That's our attrition. That's tough. And therefore, I think you need this incredible passion to kind of sustain that. At the same time, I think, like, it's not trivial, like, as a sort of coming from the business side either, because if you can not connect to that passion or to that medical need, and if you approach it from a pure whatever microeconomics sort of standpoint, or like from a pure like financial margin perspective, I think you just cannot create this connectivity with science and medicine that I always talk about, and then that's not the right thing either. Therefore, I think you need to, no matter what, you have to have this passion, but the path you are taking in that, I think people should be much less stressed out about. I think there's a path for scientists, there's a path for people in the medical sort of sector, there is a path for business people, there's a path for people whom you didn't expect it from. It's such a diverse need of talent. Therefore, I wouldn't get stressed out about like which path one takes. I would just much more sort of worry about if this is triggering in you this, like, I don't know, passion and fire. Intensity. Okay, I think everything else doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great perspective. I came to this world where most of the work I do is in the life sciences, medical products, and I came to that from an investment MBA perspective. I don't have a science background in that, so you're right. It's about following your nose. I'm going to come back to a couple of questions in the chat, but Christoph, I remember when one of the first times we met, you described your youth, where I think it's okay to say that you are, a passionate humanist, and a really a good for the world kind of person. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's if you want to share some of those stories, I know you've got literal war stories where you helped and did things that you've always had that fire to make the world a better place. One of the core business, one of the core values of the Carey Business School is this unwavering humanity. And those principles seem to be extremely important in your work. Talk to us about how that infuses what you do. Again, I know some of the wonderful stories of your past, but talk to us about how that really translates.
Yeah, it's like the joke, right? And say like, what should I talk here? Just mention that I'm really modest. I mean, that would be weird. Definitely no. I mean, just like different people are driven by different things, and money, respect, just doesn't drive me. No, I mean, what I carry with me is sort of some people on the call might have read the book of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, right? That is to a certain degree also a Hopkins story. It's not a pretty Hopkins story, really, but I was part of that story, of course, as the scientist at Hopkins who showed the HeLa cells that are the whole topic of controversy of that book to the family and the children of Henrietta Lacks, where the cells were taken without her knowledge. And the family for many, many years thereafter were living not far away from Hopkins and had no health insurance. For that, and people always ask me, why did you do this? And whatever, I am just because I thought it was the right thing. I didn't think about this much. Okay, this is just some form of, if nobody else gives them any credit, why can't you just think about what you can do? And as having worked with HeLa cells, once I heard that story, I was like, you need to, I don't know, it's just an obligation. And of course, I didn't know what it all triggered, be it the book, but also later on. And that's why I mention it, because in the end, it has all a good ending for the family, of course, but also the bigger picture of the conversations that we have around sort of consents. But also for Hopkins, what Hopkins made for the undergraduates, the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, sort of required reading. I was like, yes, that is, I think, it's a sign of reflecting, and it's a sign of rethinking. And I'll be really happy when I see that building to be populated that will be called the Henrietta Lacks building on our campus, because I think it shows a lot for a school that has a history, that has been prominently also been discussed in that context. That's not always pretty, and I'm not saying there was any malicious kind of thing in it, just like maybe not thinking through it all the time, but then reflecting on it and identifying itself with the right thing in the future and standing up for that. And I think that becomes a symbol for our future generations. And having played a little part in this gives me enormous satisfaction.
Well, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat, and so I'm gonna about the world of venture capital, and let me just punctuate what you said. That it is clear to me. I've known Christoph for a while now, and it's clear to me that you're, as you said, you're not motivated by money. That is not your motivator. You did not, quote, become a venture capitalist because that was where you could make the most money. It was very clear that as you moved from Bert's lab and got your MBA and worked at Novartis and on, that it was about how you could follow the science towards the most impact. And I think the best venture capitalists, at least those that I work with, have that in mind. They have the science in mind. They understand where the faculty are coming from, where the scientists are coming from, and they're able to really speak those languages. It truly is about speaking different languages. I feel that way sometimes. So there are a couple of questions in the chat about finishing people that are finishing their MBA, they're interested in the venture world. How would you advise them how would you advise them to do further research or to be able to enter this world?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit before. There is no clear path, right? And as there's no clear path to a lot of things, right? I just think that, as we discussed before, the anchor is very important, like achieving something first. I mean, you cannot go out there and say like, I have this discussion a lot with young people. They say like, Christoph, how can I become like in 30 years? They're like, what do you want to become? They say like, in 30 years, I want to be a partner at Third Rock like you are today. And I'm like, okay, like where should we start? Okay, I don't know what that path looks like. You cannot describe that path. And also it was never in my mind or in somebody else's mind. I think you cannot go out there. You can say like, I want to become a doctor, okay? There's a pretty clear path to it, okay? You know what to study, you know what to do next, you know, and then you work your way into this. And, but you can't go out there and say like, hey, I even think it's hard to say like, I want to become an entrepreneur. Even that is convoluted because there's no clear path. I think it's just, I guess what has to drive you is the desire, but not sort of the roadmap. There is no roadmap and people should not freak out about it, okay? Like start somewhere and follow your like instincts and like, it's like, should I do first a PhD or like also get an MBA or like, you know, in which order and like, how do I go and like which companies to join first in order to better jump into? I think it's silly.
Yeah, look, I have an opinion on that. I also, Christoph, get asked this question a fair amount. And if that is the person truly wants to be in venture and build companies, my advice is the same every time. Go join a venture-backed company and offer to do anything. Offer to make the coffee in the morning, offer to sweep at night, offer to make the pitch decks or do the spreadsheets or anything it takes. Get in the door of a venture-backed company. And if you're lucky, that company will have an exit, have some success. You'll learn, and then that will position you. So I think the ability to be there and to contribute to an exit and to some success, to me, it seems like is a potential path. I don't know if you agree, but
I agree.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. Mirza is saying, as a startup founder, she is beginning to approach investors for seed round funding. What advice would you give to her as an early stage founder to approach these initial meetings?
Yeah, first get used. It's really tough. Okay, it's really tough. I myself started one of my companies that we ended up bootstrapping. It's still bootstrapped today. We launched it maybe 7 years ago. Does a lot of good, but we're not raising money. Now, it's very different from many other companies that I launched, but it's tough. And what you find is people have different flavors. Some people like risk, other people hate risk. Some people invest in certain areas that you might think are silly, and but don't invest in yours. Maybe a couple of advices. The first one is work on your story. And this is not get a coach or like spend a whole weekend on redoing your slides. This is a year of hard work, daily work, exposure, sweat and tears and feedback you don't want to hear, and redoing it and again and over, resetting, redoing till you sort of have your story. I think that's number one. And number two is try to listen very carefully what you hear. People are always like, I need to convince them about, I've not done a good job explaining whatever. Just shut up for a moment and listen what people tell you. And you will notice, if you do this well and often, that there will be a pattern. There will be some consistency in the feedback. And that's what you work on. Maybe people understand a certain piece not well. Maybe there's something that you make a mental leap that's very clear for you, but you lose potential investor. Maybe there's something that if you were to reposition it, they were to be okay with it, but they don't like it the way it is. And then understand those patterns and then reset your story. Still keep your North Star, because that's your belief. That's where your passion is. But the story to it, that can come in many different flavors and perturbation. And you only get to it if you really work hard on it and if you listen. Therefore, that's, I think, is a huge, it seems extremely trivial, but I think it's like a huge part of the success. Maybe a third one is surround yourself with the best people. Don't feel good about being the one who knows better than the rest, and about like being the alpha in that group and like, dominating a thing because it's your company, whatever. Hire people, attract people who are much better than you, who understand the space that you know nothing about, who like outpace you, who challenge you and whatever, because in the end, it's all about the quality of the team. Tell you, a lot of academic founders struggle with the latter.
Yeah, I think you're right. I tell folks who are trying to raise their first venture dollars, you have to get used to hearing no. It's almost as bad, maybe not as bad, but it's almost as bad as going to Hollywood and trying to become an actress, or going to the publishing world and trying to get your first book published by a big publishing house, right? The odds are about the same, probably. And in particular, if you're a female founder, it's that much harder, right? Only 2% of venture capital dollars go to women. So you got to get used to hearing no, and you've got to have people around you that will tell you the truth, as you said. So, I've got another question here. Thank you, Farah, for suggesting this question. Drawing from your expertise in oncology, they were wondering if the current setting of very low success rate for biotech, what are the keys for kind of the future of successful companies in diagnostics and or therapeutics? Is machine learning, combination drugs, like how can one improve the odds, knowing where technology is and where it's going?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of components to that. The first one is our odds have improved, okay, with the introduction of personalized medicine, rather than giving, especially in oncology, drugs to like, by organs and not understanding mechanisms, but doing this based on genetics and better understanding of patient population has had a dramatic impact on the efficacy of drugs, but also on how to conduct clinical trials and be more successful earlier. Therefore, I think shouldn't forget that. I mean, what those last 20 years has happened in that space is just dramatic and exciting and super, super important. Therefore, I think that's one. We have not seen that yet in other therapeutic areas. I think that's where a trend will be. I expect that to happen also in autoimmune diseases, in immunology, where we better understand over the years who are the patient populations that actually respond and don't. I think that will be a dramatic improvement, and we'll see a lot more of that. That's one. The second one, of course, like all the ones that were mentioned, there's always new technologies, there's always new approaches. I think machine learning is, of course, a key component. We tend to say it's esoteric. Maybe that was true 4 years ago. Machine learning is not esoteric whatsoever. It's an integral part of, I would say, every modern drug discovery company. It's I cannot imagine a company that hasn't one or two sort of people in that space in their own company. It's totally normal to us. I know for many people, it's still like the new thing out there, not for hardcore drug discoverers. It's normal thing, combinations, standard. Our thinking of that is evolving, but like you must do combinations. Therefore, all those components are much more advanced than we actually think. The tough part is diagnostics, but there we see changes also. People tended not to invest in diagnostics at all. I mean, you know that, right? If you run a therapeutics company, then like, good luck. There were angel investors who like the medical device space because they can touch it and they can assess it because they can look at a vacuum cleaner and plug it in and see if it's broken or working. Therefore, that was an investment strategy for angel investors who come in with less money, and because it's tangible. Of course, the return is less prominent, but from a VC perspective, it was all about therapeutics. This has changed over the last few years, and I think that's important because therapeutics is so impactful. And what we have seen, Foundation Medicine is one of our Third Rock companies, was one of the first in that space. Then we saw Flatiron, of course, being bought by Roche. And then we saw more and more in the diagnostic space. We are talking about a potential acquisition of Grail by Illumina. The offer was $8 billion. The FTC sort of felt that's not appropriate. That's just totally new. But like those are big numbers. We see the Gardens, the Archers, the Freenoms of the world, all of them in evaluations of $1, $2, $3 billion. You saw us at Thrive, if the whole deal together, $2.5 billion. Those are huge numbers. Exact Sciences was a stool test, being like a $20-some billion company. This is the new normal, and it's very important for diagnostics. It's investable. It shows big returns, and that will just have huge impact on healthcare. Therefore, and we'll see the same in some of the data sciences companies.
Great. Okay, we have time for at least one more. I'm absolutely dying to know your take on this. What is your take on the collapse of the Super League?
Yeah, that is very important to me, of course, right? I'm a big Chelsea fan. Okay, I mean, I am like, this has been my, oops, I was just trying to do something. This has been, since we are talking about it, this has been my club, like this is, you can do that.
Oh, there you go. Oh yeah, nice.
This is important to me. Chelsea was the last club that signed up for it, just 2 days before the announcement, and was the second one that also decided to drop out of it again. If I'm proud of that, it's important. For those who don't know what we are talking about soccer, and we are talking about potential league. But there is a lesson that might be relevant to all of us that has actually very little to do with soccer. How come that owners of those clubs are so detached that they did not expect that the fans, even the players and managers, will have no understanding for a move where it's about money, where it's about like sort of, warranting your status and not being willing to measure yourselves, against everybody else, and like taking on the battles against the small and the unknowns and the ones, the desperate. And I think it tells us something. It tells us also in business how dangerous it is to, as a leadership, to disconnect from our stakeholders, from patients, when it is in the business of medicines, from your employees, from your shareholders, because you live in a new reality, and it's super dangerous and it's absurd, like the Super League. It's absurd how quickly those things, and everybody's like, what were they thinking? Okay. And I think it applies to businesses too. I remember Home Depot. I want to tell you the story because it's like a great story. Okay. Home Depot, they got in big trouble. Okay. Like, and everybody, and what did they do? Like, if you were waiting in line for longer than 5 minutes, you got your money back. Totally idiotic. They didn't know what's going on. Everybody knew what was going on. You came with your dirty clothes, like in the middle of some job, whatever, go there and look for a certain screw, and they don't have it. The other huge issue is inventory, and the leadership didn't know it. They were fixing some problem that wasn't important. And I think it just tells you how connected we need to stay and with our purpose and like with our employees.
I think that is a beautiful lesson. One of the things that we try to do so much in my group is remember exactly who the customer is, who the stakeholder is, and what we're trying to do. And of course, with Johns Hopkins, it all comes back to impact. Sure, it's great to have a licensing deal and some equity in a company as successful as Thrive, but at the end of the day, it has to be about the impact and what's right. And I agree with you. Those are great messages. Well, Christoph, it has just been an absolute joy. I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Trantis to say goodbye. But vielen Dank. Really appreciate your being here.
Gern geschehen.
Well, thank you. I really want to thank both of you, and Christy, you so masterfully pulled out Christoph's real passion, not just the passion you were talking about for most of the hour, which is wonderful. And I also thought the discussion on unwavering humanity was particularly apt, given that this week is Beat Week, which I won't go into the long explanation of what that is. It actually relates to sugar beets, and a great story about the philanthropy of Bill Carey, whose motto was doing good while doing well. So it all ties in very nicely, and I hope if any of you are available tomorrow at noon to listen into our discussion with the two principals from the W.P. Carey Foundation about Bill Carey and his life of philanthropy, and so on. But thank you again so much, Christoph and Christy. It was a fascinating discussion, and thank you to all of our audience members and for your great questions as well. So I'll leave it at that and say good evening to you all.